All right, in the last video, I talked about how I typically plan my software projects or like my small little web applications. And I usually start with diagrams that help me visualize what the user is going to do in the system and how the system kind of reacts to the user's actions. So I figured I would start to try to implement some of this logic using test-driven development and see how well we do. This is going to be a live coding session, so I don't really have much planned other than a small little project already kind of set up with TypeScript. So we're going to be doing this flow where a user kind of can click on a button on a UI, and that button is going to do a post request to an endpoint to basically vote on a thumbnail. And that endpoint is going to basically take that ID of the thumbnail and move it from one directory to either a good directory or a bad directory. And then after that's going to return a 200 status code, and then my UI is going to refresh. So I'm going to try to do all this just using Express. We're not going to use Mongo. We're not going to use like React. We're just going to use Express and hopefully use like a templating language like Pug or something to do this. But I would like to focus on test-driven development. So the first thing I want to do is let's write a function that does this logic, number 3. So basically you give it an ID and it moves that file to either one directory or another directory. So that should be pretty straightforward if you're a beginner. So let's start with that. Let's just make this real simple. I'm going to make a source folder, and inside that source folder, I'm going to make another file called thumbnailmover.js. Before we start implementing anything in here, again, this is supposed to be like a test-driven development video. So you want to write a test first. And notice that I'm not even writing the Express stuff. I haven't even imported Express, but I can still start writing functionality and testing the inner subcomponents of what I think I need to do using test-driven development. So I'm going to also make another file called thumbnailmover.test.js. And inside of this file, I am using TypeScript, so I'm going to rename all this to TypeScript. But don't worry, if you don't know TypeScript, it's really not that much different than JavaScript. All right, so we have a test file. I'm going to go ahead and put a describe block. And I'm going to say I'm going to be testing the thumbnail mover here. And that's going to have a couple of it statements inside of it, and we are going to kind of write our tests inside this it statement. So if you don't know how jest works, typically you write a describe block and you put the thing that you're trying to test. So either the component name or the file name, you put it in the describe block, and then inside these it statements you put the actual like test scenario you want to verify. So in this case, we're going to say if given a image ID and an argument of good, move the image to a good directory. Okay, so it's a little bit verbose. The more verbose you can make the test case title, I think it's good. So if I give this thing, this function or class, whatever I decide to make this, an image ID and an argument of good, move the image to a good directory. Okay, and I can condense this if I want to, but let's just go ahead and start trying to write out some functionality. So before we even look at the implementation, remember this file is completely empty. We can actually try to figure out what the method signature needs to be here. So I could say, let's just pretend that we need to call a function. And off the bat, since we're dealing with I/O, I'm going to say it's an asynchronous function. So I'm going to say await here, and I'm going to call thumbnail mover. And make sure you also put async here. All right. So we're going to call a function called thumbnail mover, and I need to give it an image ID. And I need to give it is good. Right, so that's pretty simple. And then we can also declare these up here. So I'll say it's good, and I'll say const image ID is equal to my image.jpg or something like that. All right, so now we actually have a test that's describing what the function needs to look like. This is the function signature, and what we can actually do is we can use this signature to start implementing something. But before we do that, remember in test-driven development, you need to have a failing test. So we need some type of describe statement to verify if this is doing what it needs to do. So we kind of have a test case right now, but we don't have an expect statement, right? So it's not a test unless you expect something to happen. But we know that we need to kind of deal with file systems. So what I could do is I could basically import FS here and start dealing with the file system that's built into Node. But then I have to know about implementation detail before I even written my test, which doesn't really make sense. So what you could do is pass in another argument here using like dependency inversion. So I could pass in nodes fs right here and mock it out or spy on it to make sure certain things are called. But I like to also encapsulate fs because that is a underlying node library. So what I would do instead is just make another function called like file mover, and that could just be a jest.function, okay? And basically I'm going to pass that in to, I'm going to pass that into our function as well. So again, this might be a little bit confusing because we don't even have an implementation. I'm also going to wrap this whole thing in an object because that is kind of how I like to write my functions. I don't like doing just a comma delimited list. I like named objects passing in. And what we need to do is expect that when we call this method with an image ID and is good, it should have called file mover. Expect file mover to be called. All right, so as simple as that. And we can come in through here and make this more robust in a second, but we have a test. I think if we run this, it would fail because we obviously don't have a signature. So let's go ahead and go into this file here and make a signature. So I'm going to say export const this, and I want to make sure that I also have that same signature set up. And right now I'll just return null, but okay, so now I think what we can do is we can run this test after we import this file mover. And I'm going to go ahead and do that and show you that this test should hopefully fail because we haven't actually done anything with the file mover we're passed in. Okay, so this test is failing. We have a failing test. It's saying it expected file mover to be called, and it was never called. So what we can do now is go back to the implementation and try to write a passing test. But if you want to get more robust here, because this could be called with anything and it could be wrong, you can say to be called with, I think I haven't used called with that much, but I believe I can give it like some arguments, and that'll kind of be like the directories. So I'm going to say images slash backlog, and then we can say dot images slash good. How about that? Let's try to see what happens if we run this. I think this is how you use called with. Okay, so now we're pretending that there's a function called file mover, which takes in two arguments, the source directory and the destination location or something. And it's basically going to take this file and move it from here to here. In fact, I should probably do something like this. I need to verify that it's calling the right, passing the right image. Again, just a heads up, this is a live coding. So again, I don't have like the perfect solution in my head. I'm just kind of going with what I think might work good. And I think this would be a better approach. Okay. So now what we can do is we can go back to our test and we can start implementing some logic. So we can say, instead of returning null, we can say if is good, do something else, do something else. And then inside of here, we can say await file mover, and we need to basically pass in images slash backlog slash image ID. And we need to make sure that we move this image to a good folder. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and see if we get a passing test now. And we do, the test is passing. And just remember that we haven't implemented what file mover actually does, but we can do that in a second. But let's go back to our test and write another failing test because there is another case that we need to cover. There is a is bad case, right? So I'm going to copy this whole statement, paste it in and say if given an image ID, let me fix this, in an argument of bad, move the image to a bad directory, okay? So this test is very similar, but instead of is good, we're going to say is good is false. And this should hopefully move it to a bad folder directory. So the test is pretty straightforward, just like the other one. Run it, make sure it fails. And it does, because it's saying that it was not called with the correct arguments. And we can go back and implement this logic here and just basically say, make sure you move the image to the bad folder. All right, so now that we actually have in working implementation, and we have a working test as well, we can start refactoring this to make it a little bit cleaner, because right now this code looks a little bit redundant. So I'm going to say const source image location is equal to this. And I can go ahead and pass that in. And then I can also say destination location is going to be equal to is good. And then I can say good or bad. So just do like a little ternary operator here. And then we could simply just call file mover with those things. All right, so if this works, we should get 2 passing tests. So we refactor the code. It looks a little bit cleaner. I don't know if you can consider this clean. So I think I'm going to say destination rating like this. I'll just say rating. How about that? So you can kind of dynamically change the rating if you want to. I'm going to put this in here and let's run it one more time to make sure our test is passing. Okay, so again, anytime that you have like conditional logic, you have different branches in your code, you want to make sure you test both of those branches. And there is a way in Jest to show your code coverage if you want to get down that path, but I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. So now we have an actual like function that should hopefully move images from one directory to another. Again, we have to implement this file mover thing. We haven't implemented this yet, but we could technically just do that real quick. So I'm going to make another file called filemover.js, or sorry, not JS, TypeScript. And we are going to make a filemover.test.typescript. So this one, we probably don't need to test as heavily because underneath the scene, we're just going to be using like Node's file system. So I'm going to say file mover. Again, try to do some more test-driven development. We're going to have an if statement that says should invoke, should try to move a file using Node's fs. All right, so let's pretend we have a file mover and we want to basically call it with the same function or the same files. So I'm going to call file mover. I'm going to do an await on it just like we did before. And this is going to be a very similar test to the one that we did previously. But we are going to basically give it a location like a.jpg. We'll say source a.jpg, and then we're going to call, what am I doing? Destination a.jpg. All right, so if I call this, I should expect that it tried to call Node's file system. So again, you can kind of do dependency inversion if you wanted to. I might just actually just do a jest mock here. So let's just pretend that this thing has to use Node's file system. So I think up here I can say jest.mock. And then inside of this describe, what I'm going to do is just before each of these tests, I want to mock out fs dot. Oops, how do they do this? Oh, you got to import it first. Okay, so they import the library like this. So I can import fs from here. As you can tell, I don't really use this mock function too often. So you can import this, and then I can say fs.rename.mock implementation. And I believe this function actually needs to have a callback passed in. So I could say like source, destination, and then callback. And really what we want to do is just invoke the callback here. Actually, let me see if Node has a rename sync. They do. I'm going to say rename sync instead. Rename sync. And I'm going to say mock return value. Or yeah, I'm going to do mock implementation. And I'm just going to have it do nothing basically. Now I am using TypeScript, so it's complaining about some stuff here. I had to add this because TypeScript doesn't know how to like do this stuff. So I had to do this kind of hacky, rename this method as a mock, and then I can call mock implementation. But basically what I'm doing is I'm saying anytime someone calls fs rename sync, I can actually spy on it as called and verify some things. So I'm going to call file mover, and I want to verify that rename sync was called. So expect to be called. Let's see if this test actually runs. Again, we don't have file mover defined. So I'm going to go ahead and say export const file mover, and that needs to be source and destination. And what that can do is for right now do absolutely nothing. Let's run the test suite and see what happens. Let me run the actual write test here. Unexpected token. So first of all, I did not import file mover, and then I believe I have an extra, I got something extra going on over here. I'm missing a parenthesis here. Let's try running it again, see what happens. So it's saying that it should have been called, but it was never called. So let's try doing something with this. And what we could do is import it here. So I'm going to say const fs, or say import fs from file system. And then I can say fs.rename sync source and destination. And I think that should hopefully make the test pass, because now we're actually verifying that it's called. So that works. And I would like to refactor this a little bit more to say was called with. And this could be a little bit, let's rename this. So I'm gonna say source is this, const destination is this. So it should be called with source and destination. So let's see what happens if we just refactor this a little bit and we verify that this is called with the right stuff. Cool. So it seems like it's being passed. I want to make sure that if I break something, that the test fails. So I'm just going to put like a hard-coded string here, and the test should hopefully fail. Yep, looking good. So at this point, you might be like, Cody, this was a lot of extra work just to get the whole idea of using Node's file system out of this. And it was, but the whole idea is that now this is not coupled to Node's file system. You can bring in a third-party library that does better file I/O, and this doesn't have to care about it, because all you need to do is just pass in whatever interface or whatever function can be used for moving a file. That could be Node's file system, that could be any npm package that you find online, that could be a custom implementation, and you don't worry about having this coupled to Node. Is this a good approach? You can argue that it's, I don't know, over engineering, but I think it's cleaner because it's easier to test, it's easier to understand what's going on, but you have to type out a little bit more code. So we wrote 2 files, we wrote 2 functions, and we have those tested. We tested those with test-driven development. Let's actually verify that some of this stuff works, because I'm going to wrap up this video in just a second. So what I want to do is just make a quick little index.ts file, and I'm going to import the thumbnail mover from the thumbnail mover file, and we're just going to go ahead and call it, and we're going to pass it those 3 things. So I'm going to say image ID is equal to testing.png, and then is good is true, and then we need to have a file mover set up. So I'm going to say file mover is equal to, right now I'm going to basically say file mover. We could import that from the top. Let me go ahead and import that like this. All right, so hopefully if I run this function, what should happen? And I'm going to make this, I think this should be a promise chain. So I'm going to say then console.log hello. I just want to make sure it prints out hello if everything's good. So what we can do here is we need to make sure we have a directory set up. And I think it needs to be set up in the source folder, but we can kind of change that in a little bit. We need to have an images, and we need to also have a good folder. We need to have a bad folder, and then we also need to have a backlog. And then inside that backlog, I'm going to make a file called testing.png, because that is what we're kind of verifying in this. So I'm actually running the real implementation here, and technically you could start writing like an integration test if you wanted to, but I'm going to say mpx ts node, and I'm going to say source of index.ts and see what happens. So what this should do, fail, because it's complaining about a lot of TypeScript stuff. So what I need to do is go back to my TypeScript. This needs to be a function. I just need to add types to all these things. Image ID is a string, and then is good is a boolean. I think this is all I need to do. Okay, this needs to be a string as well. Let's just go ahead and add those in. And let's see what happens if it makes any progress. It's still complaining about some stuff. I don't know why it's complaining about these. Cannot find name image ID. It's right here. This is sometimes why I do not like using TypeScript. I know TypeScript is better when you have a larger team, but I don't know. What I'm going to try doing instead is just say thumbnail mover args. I'm going to make this an interface. So sometimes when you need to like declare the types of some things, you'd have to basically do something like this. And then I'm going to say options, and that is going to be a type thumbnail mover. And again, I'm a TypeScript noob, so I think I might be able to do something like this, hopefully. If anyone knows and is watching, like, let me know what's going on here. But let me just do this. I think I'm making this too complicated. I'm just going to say options.image.id, options.image.id, options.isGood, and then options.filemover. This might have been overkill. Let me try doing this. I'm going to run this and see what happens. So it's saying no such file or directory. Rename images backlog testing. Now I think testing that PNG images good. I think this actually needs to be pulled up one level. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull this out to the top level and see if this works again. All right, so you see here it moved that file into the good directory, and I can also add like another bad.png or hello.png. And I could simply say, I'm going to rerun this file and say hello.png, and I'm going to say as good as bad. All right, so that was a lot of extra overhead just to get this working, but oh, this needs to be false. What am I doing? All right, so it moved the file from the backlog to bad, and also we saw that it moved the file from backlog to good, depending on what you pass for true and false. Well, hopefully this tutorial helped you kind of understand how to do test-driven development using TypeScript and Node. We're going to continue on building onto this by bringing in Express and building an API endpoint. But for right now, let's just keep this a shorter video. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Also, leave a comment below if you have a different way that you like to do testing or test-driven development. And then also be sure to subscribe if you're new to this channel, because I'm going to have other videos like this that should hopefully help you become a better web developer in the future. Okay, so in the last video, I showed you how to kind of use test-driven development to build out these files. We got a file mover, we got a thumbnail mover, and these are basically going to be subcomponents of our API to help us move files from one directory to another. The next step is we kind of need to build out an API, right? So I need to bring in Express, and I want to try to do this using a test-driven approach. So hopefully I can do this. I just want to say I'm not a professional at test-driven development. I'm doing this mainly to try to learn more. So if you have suggestions of how I can do it better, leave me a comment below. So before I actually install Express, you can actually do test-driven development using integration tests, right? So I could start writing a test that verifies that I have an endpoint that does something, right? When I hit the endpoint, it actually moves a file from one folder to the next. So what we could do is we could try to write that integration test first and then install Express and start building out our REST API. So I'm just going to make a new folder called, like, I don't know, integration. And there's different ways you can kind of structure your project. I'm just kind of doing it how I like it, and I refactor it later. So I'm going to make a new file inside of that. And this file is going to be called rate a thumbnail test.ts. Okay, so this is going to be an integration test, right? And there's a lot of ways that you can do integration tests. Like a lot of people like to bring in something called super test, or you could just simply use Axios and hit like your local running API. I don't know which way is best. I think I'm just going to use Axios and see how that works. So what we could do is write a describe block, and remember that inside this string is like kind of like the component or module or API endpoint that you're hitting. Let's just, for right now, I can put like post at slash. So I'm actually going to put like the URL and the method that we're going to do on that URL. And I'm going to say thumbnails, thumbnails / ID / votes. Okay, so someone can do a post request to this endpoint, and that is supposed to rate a thumbnail from good or bad. Now inside of this, let's do an it statement, and I should say should move a thumbnail from the backlog directory to the good directory. Actually, I could say when upvoting or when approving a thumbnail, it should move a thumbnail from the good directory to, or from the backlog directory to the good directory. Okay, so a couple things we got to do here, right? First thing is we need to actually try to hit an endpoint. So I'm going to say, let's just use Axios to keep this simple. I don't know. A super test might be easier. But I'm going to install Axios here. Hopefully this works out pretty well for a live coding session. But I can import Axios, so import Axios from Axios. And I think I might need to install the types for this library, but we'll see what happens. So we can basically say Axios, doing a wait on it. Let me make sure I add async here. Ooh. Async. And I don't remember if it's like .post. Yep, it's .post. I can put this URL here. And I think there's a way to put, maybe I need to put like a localhost here. I might have to go look at the docs. URL, let's just try this. HTTP localhost. We'll do 8080. Let's pretend our Express app is running on 8080. We're going to hit thumbnails, ID of votes. Okay. And that needs to take a payload. Well, typically that takes a payload, but I don't think our endpoint is going to do anything with that payload. I guess it could. We could send like is good is true or something. So if someone hits this endpoint with an is good, we should expect something. So I'm going to say expect, and we don't know what we need to expect yet, but we should probably be looking at these directories and make sure that stuff has been moved around. So again, this is an integration test. So we can actually test and verify that the file system has done something. You could always mock out the file system if you wanted to in your integration tests, because we are still integrating a subset, right? We're integrating the front part connection of our Express app. If you wanted to mock out the backend, you could do that. It could just be a little bit more tedious to get set up if you wanted to do like an in-memory file system. But let's just do this. I'm going to say expect that if we import fs, so we're going to use nodes file system, and we can basically say look for the good file, fs.read file sync. I think there's another method you can use. I think it's called like test. I don't know. Let's see. Node fs check if file exists. I think it's called stats maybe. I don't remember what this is, but you know what? There's no harm in. Ooh, okay, here we go. Exists sync. Hopefully this works. So basically we need to check if the good file exists. So does good file exist? Okay. And what we could do is basically put a path to that /images/good/testing.png. And if this exists, to be defined, then we should be good. Or to be truthy, I think is what we want. All right, moment of truth. Let's try running this and see what happens. Probably won't work. Nothing ever works the first time in coding. All right, so it's trying to hit the backend on port 8080 and it's failing. And obviously it's failing because we don't have an Express app even created yet. So again, using test-driven development, I'm running an integration test. I'm verifying that if I hit an endpoint, it returns, or it does some type of functionality behind the scenes. Technically, you could like check a database here if you wanted to make sure that the file exists or whatnot. But I'm just checking that there is a file inside testing.png. And I think there's a little bit of extra setup I might need to do. We probably want to put that file, because remember how this works? It's going to basically take a file from the backlog and put it into a good folder. We need to do like a before, I think it's before all. So before all, and then we need to set up that file. So I'm going to say, let's just take that fs method, and I'm going to say write file sync, and I need to put that in the backlog. And the content of that could be like hello world. And let's see if this works. Let's run it again and see if it at least makes the file. Okay, there is a testing file there. But we should also verify that it deletes this file, right? So we're going to have to actually check that it doesn't exist in the backlog anymore. So backlog of testing was file removed from backlog. I like to be very verbose with my variables, as you can tell. All right, so was file removed from backlog. This should be falsy, should be gone. And does good file exist, should be truthy. So I hope that makes sense. I think that is a good test. I don't know if we should do some cleanup in this test. Like, since this file's sticking around, I might need to clean it up. But yeah, let's just go forward with this. We have a test, and I think we're in a good position. So let's install Express. So I'm going to install Express here. And at this point, what we can do is we could basically get set up with Express. So inside the index.ts, I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this logic. Actually, we can probably keep some of it, let's be honest. And instead, we could just import Express and start building out an Express app. So I think you can do this. I think it's express.start or listen, port 8080, express.post. Oh wait, no, it's app. It's like const app equals new. Just call Express. I mean, I might have to go to the docs to remember how to do this. It's been a while since I've built out an Express app from scratch. So you import Express, and I'm going to basically create an app, and then I'm going to say app.post, and we need to listen to that thumbnails ID, and that could be votes. And that needs to call a method like so. And we could basically, I think we can kind of keep this stuff around and kind of call it here. So let's just call this. And this is a promise, so I'm going to await on it. And I'm going to say res.json. Maybe I'll just send back a success message. How about that? So again, if you wanted to do like smaller incremental test-driven development, you could just write this endpoint and send back success. And then here you can verify that it didn't crash or you got back a result. So I'm going to say, like, you can do this stuff. I don't like doing this. I find it kind of pointless in my opinion. But I can say, like, expect the data that came back to equal hello or whatever I called it. I don't remember what success. Success. All right, so you can do this and try verifying that your test case actually works. All right, this is failing because I didn't actually start my server. So let me go ahead and open up a new terminal and just start my server. So I'm going to go ahead and I like adding a start script to my package.json, and I can say npx ts node index.ts. So npm start. Hopefully that works. What is this? Can I find, source slash, my bad, source slash index.ts. All right, so did it run? All right, I'm getting more TypeScript errors because I probably need to, first of all, install the types for Express. So npm install save dev at types/express. And then we probably need to actually have these be typed so that it doesn't complain to us. And I don't know what those need to be. I think it's like maybe response, and I think that should work. Let's try that. All right, so since we're running an actual like integration test, you need the service to be running. So I have the service running over here, and I'm going to go ahead and just try to run this test. Again, it should hopefully pass because the endpoint is returning success. And if I were to break this and add like an exclamation mark, we should see that it fails. And it didn't. So what's going on here? Let's go back to our test. We probably are doing something incorrectly. So we're doing a post to thumbnails ID votes. Oh, my bad. So when you save your Express file, you need to restart your server. I should probably get NodeMan going, but I'll do that in a second. Let's rerun that test. And it's failing because it's saying that we got back success with an exclamation mark. So our test works. We have a small little incremental failing test. We know that we can hit the API at this endpoint. Now what we need to do is just start implementing some logic and go ahead and remove that little fake thing. I don't think we care about result here. Well, I guess we could care about the status code. I think we could probably say like expect result dot, what is it? Status to equal 200. Let me go ahead and install NodeMon. I think there's a way to do NodeMon with TypeScript. I haven't done this. I think you can just use it. So I'm going to say npm install save dev NodeMon, and then opening up our package JSON, we could simply just say NodeMon, and then the file, I believe. Oops. I always do that. When stuff's installing, I update the package JSON, and then like it blows away my changes. So let's try this. Let's try npm start. This should start NodeMon over a file, and they already have TypeScript support built in. So we are in a better position now. And to verify that, if I save this file, we should see our API restart. All right, so I hope you are staying with me. We wrote a test, we ran it, it failed. We brought in Express, built out a simple backend endpoint with simple logic. We kind of changed the test to be simpler, just to kind of show you can do incremental improvements. And then we ran it and the test passed, but I need to actually implement real functionality now. So if I uncomment this, we need to kind of modify how this works a little bit. So the ID needs to come from the request, right? So I say const ID is equal to rec.params, and I could do some type of like object destructuring here. Oops, and I'm sure why that's not working. Let's go like this. So this could be ID. And for is good, that needs to come over in the payload. So I can say const is good is equal to rec.body. Okay, so that should have an is good here. And I think we could just simply do this. If I want to get more fancy, I could just do this to make it a little bit cleaner. So this should hopefully do the logic. And then I'm going to say res.send. I'm going to give that success message back still. And I think by default, this should have a status of 200. So let's just go ahead and run this test again. And actually make sure that we don't have a testing file laying around here. Let's just get rid of that. Go ahead and run it and see what happens. All right, so we definitely have some type of failure. It looks like it's timing out. So we made a file, we hit the endpoint, and did the API crash? It did. So the API crash said could not destructure property is good at rec.body as it is undefined. So I don't know why it would be undefined. I'm probably using this incorrectly. So let's go back and say axios.postdocs. And let's see how we do a post. Should just be the endpoint followed by the payload. So let's go back. Why is rec.body undefined? Because that doesn't really make sense. We are passing it in. And I think the issue is that we're not using body parser. Okay, so I probably forgot to set up body parser. So there's a middleware that you can use in Express. I can say app.use express.body parser, I believe. I have to look this up. I don't remember what it is. Express body parser. I know there's a middleware, but they deprecated this for something else. Yeah, maybe this blog post will tell us something. Oh, it's express.json. That's what it is. All right, so this middleware allows our API endpoint to basically take JSON content type requests, process them so that we can actually like use them. So let's try it again. Our test is actually helping us out as we are trying to implement. If you imagine if you're a beginner trying to do some of this stuff, you would just be sitting here wondering like, why is this not working? All right, so the test timed out again. No such file or directory. So we are making progress. Stuff is moving along. But now we're running into an issue saying that there is no backlog of ID. And I'm not sure why ID is coming over like that. Rec.params. I'm going to print out what rec.params is here. And go ahead and rerun this. I'm sending over ID. Is my test broken? Like, what am I doing here? Oh, of course, my test is not working properly. I'm sending over the bad code. So Again, maybe this is why you should do smaller increments when you're doing test-driven development, because this should actually be the ID of the file. I should say testing.png. So before I go any further, let's just say like image ID is equal to that. And then I'm going to refactor all this to dynamically interpolate image ID. All right, so that should be a cleaner test. Let's just do some refactoring right here. And sometimes I hate when it auto completes my brackets because it's like in that case, I don't want the double bracket there. I'm just trying to do some refactoring. All right, let's try it again, ladies and gentlemen. Let's save this and let's rerun this. Let's see what happens. All right, so the test passed. It moved the file from bad directory to the good directory. So we know that the integration test works. It's actually doing what it needs to do. And again, this logic is kind of covered at a lower unit test level. So it's kind of up to you if you wanted to also test the other scenario where it goes from backlog to bad. I don't know if I'll just do it just because it's probably better to have more coverage than not. But as your project gets really, really large, you want to make sure you don't have duplicate logic being covered. So this integration test is just verifying that the API can accept the post request. It does do some type of logic, but I'm just going to go ahead and say when disapproving a thumbnail, it should move the thumbnail from the backlog directory to the bad directory. So a very similar test. Instead of good, we're going to say false. So the user does not like that thumbnail, and we need to move it from backlog to bad. But one thing you'll notice here is that this image testing.png is actually sticking around. So we probably need an after all to clean up these files. So I think we can say if fs file exists, or what is it called? Exists sync images slash bad slash testing.png. I could just simply say fs unlink sync and do that. Now, I don't know if I can just run unlink without having to do this check beforehand, but I'm going to do this to hopefully all the images. Now, there's probably a better way to do this. If you can think of a better way, let me know. But I'm just going to go ahead and clean it up from good, from bad, and I also don't want it to exist in the backlog, because what if the test wasn't doing what it needs to do and it just kept that file sticking around? So let's go ahead and remove this file, save that, and rerun our integration test. And when it's done running, we shouldn't see these files sticking around anymore. It should kind of move them to the corresponding folders and then delete them. Now, I don't know, I think this took longer than what we'd expect in Jest. This is the problem with integration tests, is that they can take some extra time. So I'm going to just increase the timeout a little bit and see if that fixes our issue, because the file doesn't exist anymore. But for some reason, the test timed out. Oh, it's because our backend keeps crashing. Why is the backend crashing? No such file or directory. Okay, what we want to do is change this to before each. I think the issue is that we write the file, the first test is moving it, and then the next test is failing because that file doesn't exist. So I'm just going to say before each and after each. And I don't think I need to increase the timeout because the test was just bad. So this is kind of a mess. This little video is a mess, but hopefully you're learning something. You know, I'm debugging on the fly, and this is stuff that actually happens. So I think the test case just needs to be updated. This is why I'm moving too fast. I'm moving around. I need to slow down and verify that stuff I'm doing is actually correct. So expect good file exists. Does bad file exist, right? We need to check that it's in the bad directory, and that should be truthy. And we can run this. Again, we can add more expects. Like, we should expect that there is no file moved to the good directory in this case. I don't know if that's kind of crossing the bounds of what your test should do, but sometimes it's safe to like make sure that, hey, this isn't writing to two directories. But I don't know. There's 1,000 things that a piece of code can do. So it's like, how much do you need to test in your test? I would just test the happy path. Make sure that it's put into the correct directory that you expect. And if there's a huge risk of having it put into both directories for some reason, then verify that it doesn't get put into both directories. All right, so we have an integration test. You'll notice that we have a fully working Express application. It's using that exact same code that we created in the last video. You see how easy it was just to put it in this file and everything works exactly as we intended it to. I think using test-driven development on the smaller subcomponents first can help you build out larger components. So that's what we did here. And yeah, I think that's about it. So if you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up and also leave me a comment below if you have suggestions of how I can better do test-driven development. I know at the end here I was kind of jumping around and probably not writing the best code that I could, but we fixed some of the issues along the way, and I hope you learned something from that. And then, like always, if you're new to this channel, be sure to give me a subscribe because I'm going to have other videos like this in the future that should hopefully help you become a better web developer and improve your ability to write code using test-driven development. All right, so welcome back to part 3 of this test-driven development tutorial where we are building out an Express backend using TDD. What I'm going to do here is I want to build out this other flow. If you go back to the first diagram that I showed you, we implemented the logic of rating a thumbnail, but we haven't implemented the endpoint to get a random thumbnail to kind of display in the UI. So again, using test-driven development, I want to start with some of this logic by building out a test and then building out the implementations. The thing that we need to build right here, or the kind of the business logic that we need to build, is a function that returns us a random image that we can send back to the client with a REST API. Okay, so I'm going to start at the lower level of what I think we might need, and that is we need a function that kind of lists all the files in a directory and then returns one at random. So let's just go ahead and make a test file. I'm going to say get random image .test.ts, and we can start building out a test file. So I'm going to describe and assume that there is a function called get random image. And let's just go ahead and write a simple it statement to describe what the test needs to do. So in this case, we want to say returns a random image from the images/backlog directory. Okay, and we can make this more dynamic if we want to. Like, it doesn't have to be hard-coded the images/backlog. This could be something that we pass in and it gets us a random image. So let's just go ahead and write a test. I'm going to say await, and I'm going to call a method, assuming that we have this function definition kind of implemented somewhere. We'd probably want to just call it, and that should give us back a random image in this directory. And we could abstract this some more by actually passing that directory, but let's just keep it simple. And I'm going to say the image that comes back should be defined. We can kind of make this better as we implement this more. So we have a random test, or we have a test that we should be able to run and it should fail. So let's just verify that this happens. I'm going to run this test. We should see a failure because obviously we don't have this function implemented anymore. So let's go ahead and implement this function. So implement get random image .js. Actually, it's supposed to be TypeScript. I keep putting JS for some reason. I think I named this one JS as well, so my bad. I work full-time in JavaScript, so when I'm doing these TypeScript tutorials on YouTube, I sometimes forget what I'm doing. So we need to have this function basically export a constant function named getRandomImage, and for right now it could just return null because we still want this test to fail. But we can import this in the test now, and the test should make it a step further. I mean, it's still going to fail, but it's going to fail on a different reason. It's going to say that it expected this to be defined, but it got undefined. All right, so for some reason this actually ran and it passed. So this test is bad. For some reason, this is returning null, and to be defined should not be passing. So let me just verify what's going on here, because this test should have failed. Image null to be defined. Well, I guess this to be defined just verifies that it's not undefined. So I guess this will pass, but passing for the wrong reasons in my opinion. But anyway, we can kind of work towards making this better. So let's say that there is a function that this thing can use to get all the images inside of a directory. So I'm going to say we're going to have a function that's passed in called get images in directory. And when we call this function, it's going to basically give us back all the images in a directory. So we're going to mock that out in our test. So I'll say const get images in directory is a function which is going to basically just return, I'm going to say mock return value, and that can return an array of some images. So I'll say like a.png, b.png, and c.png. All right, so now I should be able to pass that implementation using the dependency injection here. And when I run this, I should get an image back that's either going to be A, B, or C, hopefully. So what I'm going to do is abstract this a little bit more, and I'm going to say const images is this. And now that we have the images array defined up here, let's just use that here that we're going to mock out. And I'm going to say random image is going to be the result of this calling this function. And I want to make sure that random image is actually, I can do this another way. I can say images to contain random image. All right, so whatever that this thing happens to return, whatever string this happens to return, I want to make sure that it actually exists in this mock that we kind of set up here. So we should be able to run this test. It's probably going to fail. And it's saying that null did not exist in A, B, or C. So let's just go back to our implementation. We should be able to get this working by just having it actually return a random image. So get images in directory. We could say const images is equal to call this function. So in JavaScript, to return a random thing, typically you have to do like some math.pow and then you times it by the length of your array. So I'm going to say images of index, parse int, math.pow, or sorry, math.random. I don't know why I'm saying pow. And then I'm going to times that by images.length. So that'll give us a random image from an array, or random element in an array. And that should hopefully return something. Argument of type number is not assignable to parameter type string. So why is this failing? I guess parseInt is supposed to take a string, but I'm passing it a number. So I think I'd also do math.floor. That might also be better. All right, so let's try running this and see if that makes the test pass now. All right, so this test is passing. We have mocked out a get images in directory function, and that is going to return 3 strings. And we are basically verifying that this function returns a random one of those. Not necessarily the first one, the second one, or the third one, but a random one. So let's just go ahead and implement. We can kind of move down to implement this function here, because right now we don't actually have this implementation created, but we're going to need to use it in just a second. So let's just go ahead and make a new test. And again, using test-driven development, let's try to build out the test first for this function. I'll write a describe block. I'm going to write an if statement and say should return, or it returns a list of all files in a directory. Maybe I should say all file paths in a directory. Yeah, I'll just say all files in a directory. All right, so this one, we don't need to do too much. We're going to mock very similar to how we did it with this other file mover. We're going to have to probably bring in JS mock. So I'm going to pretty much bring in all this logic so we can mock out the file system, because I believe we're going to have to call something like this. And we are going to call a before each on this. I'll go ahead and run this so that we can actually mock out this implementation. And I named this .js again, so sorry about that. So let's look at the node library and see, or let's look at the FS library and see what we can do. I think there's a way to list all the files in a directory. I'm going to have to Google this actually. So let's say node fs list files in directory. Let's see if this actually has a built-in way to do it. You can use fs read dir or fs read dir sync. All right, so we're just going to go ahead with this. This should return us an array of files, and we should be able to mock this one out. So again, I like using the sync methods. If this was a production application, I would not be using the sync methods. I would be doing promises and stuff, but this is just for an example. So don't get up in arms because I'm using the sync methods in Node. So what we're going to do is we are going to basically verify, very similar to this other test, we're going to verify that this thing has been invoked. This mock has been invoked with a certain path. So I'm going to say /images/backlog. We just want to make sure it gets called with that. And then we can also verify that this function, when we call it, which we haven't actually implemented yet. So I'm going to say get images in directory. And we are going to call that with /images/backlog. And we should verify that this images that are returned should probably be equal to something. Right up here, we're mocking out the implementation of this function. But what it returns is an array of files, I believe. If you look here, it's an array of files. And each of these files probably has a name or something. I'm not really sure. I have to kind of look at that. You know, maybe we'll have the type here. If I do like fs read adder sync, and then say like images for each file. I kind of just want to see what's on this file class. This is why I'm doing this. So I can say file dot, I guess name might work. There's probably a path. Let's just pretend it's name. I think name should work. So basically we want to expect that images length, I don't know, to equal, we could say 3. And what we're going to do is mock this out. So I'm going to say this has 3 objects in it. I'm going to say name of a.png. And then I'm going to copy this 3 times. B and C. Make sure we do async here. And let's just run this and make sure it fails. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link and run this file. And just remember that this is like a persistence method. Sometimes you don't even want to test these methods because really, like, what is it doing? You're just calling an underlying file system method to verify. So this test is failing, and that is good. Let's see why it's failing. Saying that this is not defined. So now we can actually go to the implementation and make sure that when we run it, it's going to actually read a file and send back something. So let's just go ahead and make a new file. So I'll call it get images in directory.ts. I'm going to export that function. And let's just go ahead and import a file system from fs. And I'm going to say return fs.read adder sync. And I'm going to say images/backlog. In fact, we don't even really need to wait on this, but we'll probably get rid of the wait. So I'm going to make this configurable. I'm going to say this could be a directory, and I'm going to give it a string here so that we can actually like verify that we can read from different directories. And then this is going to have a type that's returned, which should be, we're just going to make it an array of strings. I think I can do that to say that this function returns an array of string. But I think I do need to make sure that this is mapped. I might have to actually do like a map on this, but we will come back and verify that in just a second. All right, so let's just run this and see to make sure that this passes or fails. Let's see how much progress we made. So this is actually passing now, but we actually want to make this so this returns an array of strings and not necessarily an array of objects, because I think this is returning an array of objects right now. So what I'm going to do instead is instead of expect length to be 3, I'm going to say expect images to equal, I'm going to say an array of a.png, b.png, and c.png. So let's just go ahead and run this test. It should fail now because this is now returning, objects, but really we want it to be strings. So let's just go back to our implementation now, and we could just do a map function on this and just return file.name. And I believe that should be all we need to do. Actually, it looks like this might just return an array of strings. So we might actually be set. I might actually be thinking that this function does something differently than what it does. So make sure whenever you're going to mock out any type of library, make sure that you're mocking out with the correct things. So I think this actually is just going to return a string of A, B, and C. So I'm totally messing this tutorial up. But again, this is like a live coding session. I haven't really planned anything. Let's try this again. Let's run it and see if it passes. It's passing now. And by the way, someone left me a comment. I really appreciate the comment. They told me a different way to basically not have to do this. And I don't remember what it was. I think it was like TS jest mock. Here it is, TS jest. Yeah, so they said I can basically use this. I don't think I have TS jest installed. TS jest, do I? No. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. npm install save dev TS jest. And I'm assuming I have to Let me go to the installation before I just start typing random stuff. Yeah, I just need to install jest. I already have the types installed for jest, so let's just run that. Go back a page, and basically if you import this mocked function here, you can do something with it. You do this. So basically you mock out the thing that you want, and then you say mocked fs. Ask it the thing you're trying to mock. Just.mock foo. Kind of confusing. Let's see. Like you import what you want, you mock it out, but then you also have like your mocked file here. But what that allows you to do is basically you can say, I think you can do this. Read adder sync. And then I have IntelliSense that says like this is good. I think. What's this complaining about? Dyrant. You know, I don't really understand what this function is doing. Again, I'm a noob at TypeScript, so what I'm going to do is just run node. I'm going to say fs, const fs is equal to require fs, and I want to see what this function actually does. So I'm going to say fs read adder sync, and I'm going to pass it images / backlog, and see what this actually prints out. I'll probably make an image here. Run that. Okay, yeah, it just gives me a string of names. So I don't know why this typing is all jacked up. It expects a dyrant. I don't even know what that is. The type string is not... Okay, I don't know what I'm doing. I'll be honest with you all. So I'm going to go and see what is going on with this. Do I need the casts as dyrants? Like, conversion of type string to the type dyrant may be a mistake because neither type sufficiently overlap with the other. Let me just try mocked return value and see if that helps in any way. Has that helped at all? Mock return value. Still complaining about needing to be a dyrant, so I think there's probably a way to this. This guy's saying that you could do this a different way. Well, you know, I'm not going to spend all day trying to figure out why this isn't working. I've gotten it working in a different test by just simply doing this little hack thing. So let's just see if I can just keep doing that little hack and see what happens. Gonna do that. You know what? I think I'll have to leave this for another day to figure out why that's not working. Probably something simple that I'm messing up on, but let's just focus on getting this working because you guys care more about test-driven development and not about how to do TypeScript. So hopefully this works. Let's just rerun this. I should be able to exit out of this and run my test. All right, let's just move on to actually making an endpoint for this, and it's just going to return a random image ID. So let's make another test. This is going to be an integration test at this point. And I'm going to rename this one. Basically, I'm going to say get a random image. And this is going to be a get request. We're going to kind of like gut all this. You know, let's just delete all this and kind of start fresh. So delete all this. This as well. And what we want to do is we want to do a get request on an endpoint. I'm just going to say just do a get request on thumbnails. And this is not like proper REST. Like this should return a list of all the thumbnails. But I mean, I could do like /random, I guess. Maybe that's more proper. But basically, when you're doing this request, you want it to basically verify a random image ID is returned. Okay, so let's try to do an integration test to verify this, and then we'll come back and implement it. So I'm going to kind of steal some code from this other file that we have open, because we are going to have to use Axios probably, and we want to basically do a request to this endpoint. I'm going to steal that code too, but instead I'm going to do a get request, and we need to make sure we hit the right endpoint, so thumbnail /random. We don't need to pass it a payload, so I'm going to delete that. So let's just verify that the result we get back is actually a file that exists in this backlog page. So before we can actually do that, we are going to probably need to create a file. So I'm going to make sure I grab this because I'm going to need to do something similar. We're going to write a file called testing.png into that folder. And we want to verify if we have like maybe, let's do A, B, and C. We verify that we get back at least one of them. So what we could also do is, remember in that other test we had a cleanup method. I'm going to go ahead and bring that over because I know we're going to need to clean up these files when we're done with them. So A, B, and C. And make sure that I'm cleaning up from the right directory. So when this test runs, it's going to create A, B, and C. And then after it's done running, it's going to delete A, B, and C. But when the test runs, we want to hit that endpoint and verify that something came back and expect result to be in one of the following files. So I'm going to say a.png, b.png, or c.png. And then I'm going to say to contain result. All right, so the API is actually running over here already, and what we could probably do is try to run this test and watch it fail. So let's run the integration test. It should hit the endpoint, but the endpoint does not exist. Got a 404 back, so that's expected. So let's go into our index.ts file, and let's go ahead and implement a new endpoint. So I'm going to kind of build off of this. I'm going to say we're going to have a get endpoint called thumbnails.random. And that needs to return us back a random image. So I'm going to say const random image is equal to await get random image. Make sure we import this. Well, it's not auto importing, so let's just import it manually. Import this file from get random image. And then we probably also need to import the get images in directory file. So get images in directory, because that is a helper function that we need to pass in using dependency injection. So when I run this, I should hopefully get back a random image, and we need to return that image, I guess I should say image path, to the user here. So let's just go ahead and send that, and hopefully this works. See what happens if the test passes or not. So TypeScript is complaining because I have an any type on this. So again, I'm kind of new at TypeScript, but just remember that you probably need to type your stuff. So I'm saying interface options, or I'm going to say get random image options is an interface with a function on it. And that function probably needs to return, I don't even know how you do the return type here. I'll have to look that up. But basically I could just say options is equal to this. Oops, do that. And then I should be able to call that here. So I hope that should no longer complain. Let me just restart my service and then rerun my test here and see what happens. At the very least, you saw it created A, B, and C, and it cleaned those back up. But if you go over to the API, you see that it actually crashed at read adder sync inside the get images and directory function. So let's look at this get images and directory function and figure out why this is failing. I'm probably sending it a bad path. So like, where am I actually calling this? Yeah, this is supposed to take an argument, and I'm not passing it in. So I should probably make a type here. This is the problem with dependency injection. You have to make sure that you actually type the right thing. So get images and directory. I should probably have this export like an interface. Oh, maybe I have to use types. I'll say export type. I think I can do something like that. And then I could just say that this thing here, this whole function here, is actually a type of this. And then I guess I don't even need to put this other stuff here. So what this allows us to do is we can go over to wherever we're calling this, and this is actually going to be this this type, I guess I should say. I'm going to rename this a type. At this point, this tutorial is all over the place because I don't know TypeScript that well, so sorry, y'all. But no one's really going to be watching this video, so it should be okay. All right, this one is now complaining. It's saying that I need to give it a pass. So I'm going to say /images/backlog. So that is why the backend API was crashing. If I would properly use TypeScript, then I should probably start reading and watching some tutorials about TypeScript. I think this would be a lot easier to do. Let's try running our test and see what happens. The backend didn't crash this time, but we got back. We actually got back a bunch of stuff, I think. So I think I'm checking the wrong thing. Let me go. This should be result.data, I believe, not result. So let's make sure that we check result.data. Try running this again. And okay, now it's passing. Because result.data, if I print this out, is actually probably just going to be like one of those files. So let's print this out real quick. Cool. All right, well, that wraps up this little function. I hope I didn't confuse the heck out of all you, because I definitely confused myself. I need to go read up on how to do more like types in TypeScript, because I think I'm doing myself and you all a disservice by not typing my functions and creating interfaces so that I can properly verify that I'm sending the right arguments and stuff. So that's my bad, but if you enjoyed watching this, give me a thumbs up or give me a thumbs down if you hated watching me struggle through what I was doing. Leave me a comment below if you have any suggestions of how I can improve my TDD process. And like always, be sure to subscribe if you found this video useful, because hopefully it helps you become a better web developer in the future. All right, have a good day. So up to this point, we've learned how to use TDD to build out Jest unit tests to help implement some subcomponents. And then we also moved on to using TDD to build out some integration tests to verify at a higher level our functions or endpoints do what we expect them to do. Now what we can do is we can use an end-to-end testing framework such as Cypress to do further TDD to implement an actual UI. Okay, so what we want to do is, I already have Cypress installed. You just npm install Cypress. And you basically need to set up a folder that looks like this. So inside of fixtures, you're going to have any type of test files. So we have a bad PNG and a good PNG. Inside integration, you have an actual test. Plugins and support are where you can define extra commands that Cypress can use. And then there's like a TS config that allows you to write TypeScript, write Cypress in TypeScript. So that's just some boilerplate setup that I did. Now, I want to let you know that I did spend a lot of time trying to write out this test, right? I started recording a video and I spent like 40-50 minutes just trying to wrap my head around how to write a proper Cypress test for this, because Cypress isn't my primary testing framework. In all honesty, Cypress follows a very different convention than like Jest. So you have to like go back to the docs and read up on stuff and make sure you're doing stuff properly. It's all a bunch of like promise chaining. So I don't know if this is the proper way to write this Cypress test, but regardless, I went ahead and wrote a test. I didn't really record me writing this test, but we are going to try to implement the functionality using what the test is verifying. So I'm going to walk you through what this test is doing, and then we are going to try to implement using TDD how to implement this endpoint. So very similar to the other tests, what we want to do is we want to kind of use Chrome to load up a browser, to load up a web page that might display an image and some buttons that we can click, right? So the test is saying a user rates the last 2 thumbnails in the backlog. So we're going to assume that there's 2 images in this backlog and the user can rate both of them. So what we're doing is, before we run this test, we want to basically copy those fixtures files over to this backlog folder. So I'm copying the good file and the bad file over to the backlogs good and then the backlog bad. So that's very similar to how we did the integration test, where we kind of copied files over into this backlog. And then like the other tests, we are cleaning some stuff up. So after this test suite runs, we want to make sure we don't have files lingering around, which could potentially fail the next run. So I'm just basically running some lower level OS commands to remove these files if they exist. And then I'm passing this additional options here, because if the file doesn't exist for some reason, this is going to crash. So you need to make sure you say fail on non-zero exit of false. I'm kind of disappointed that there's not really a way to deal with files in Cypress. There's a way to write files and read files in Cypress, but there's no way to delete files in Cypress. So that's why I went down this path of just doing lower level operating system commands to move stuff. Now, I don't know how well this will work if you're trying to run this on a Windows machine, but it works well for my Mac, so I'm just going to keep doing it that way. Well, let's move on to the first test. And what we're going to do is we're going to step through these tests one by one and try to implement out the logic. So let's read through this. The first test says a user can see the thumbnail on the page and vote on it via buttons. All right, so we're just basically saying load up a page, verify that there's an image or an element that has an ID of image, verify that it has a source tag or source attribute, And then we are kind of caching that first thumbnail ID so that we can use it later on. You'll see this kind of reference later on. You can use this as keyword to do that. And then we're saying the source attribute should have either good.png or bad.png inside of the string, right? Matches is how you can do regex against a string. So it's kind of makes sense if you load up the UI, if you have 2 files in this backlog, one of those 2 files should be displayed in the UI, okay? And then we also verify that there's an upvote button and a downvote button. So let's try to implement the functionality to make this test pass. And again, if I go back to my test case and try to run this, you will notice that it fails because we can't even go to localhost 8080. So I did actually refactor. If you watched the videos before, this public folder existed, or sorry, this images folder existed at the top level. I went ahead and moved it into the public folder so that we can host it with Express. And now what we need to do is kind of set Express up so that we can host these static files. So I'm going to go to express.es, and we want to first allow it to host any of the files that are in this public directory. So I can say app.use express.static, and then I think I can just say public. So I think this should do what we want. Go ahead and save this file. And now I should be able to go to localhost. All right, so I'm going to go to localhost 8080, and it's going to say cannot get /, but there should be some images that we could probably get. All right, so let's further verify. If we go back to our code, I'm going to go ahead and make a file inside this public directory called index.html. And I'm going to scaffold out HTML. So I'll just say like hello. We can go back and verify that this is loading. All right, so we should be good in that front. And when we rerun our Cypress test, it actually gets back hello here. Okay, so we're in a better position. The page actually loads and we're not crashing at that point, but it's actually saying it's failing because it can't find an image with a source attribute of good or bad. Let's try to implement that out. So what we're going to need to do is make an image tag. So I'm going to make an image tag like this, and we're not going to give it a source for right now because we need to dynamically change that. And let's give it a script tag. And what we want to do is when this page first loads, we want to fetch a random image. Remember, we have that endpoint that we kind of created with our Express backend. Well, we can use that endpoint to give back a random thumbnail ID. So I'm just going to make a function called const get, or I'm going to say display random thumbnail. And this is going to be an asynchronous function, so make sure you put async here. And we want to make this fetch a random thumbnail and set the source equal to that. So we can say await fetch. We want to hit that endpoint, localhost 8080 /thumbnails /random. That should give us back a random thumbnail. And then we want to basically say get the response, get the JSON. All right, maybe this is actually the text. I want to say await response.text. And this should hopefully be the random thumbnail. So I'm going to say random thumbnail ID because in our backend should just be returning some string. And what we need to do is basically get that element here. And I'm going to say document.get element by ID. We need to get our image and we need to change the source equal to, I'll do this, images backlog / this. I think we can just do this. And in fact, since this is all hosted on the same 8080, you really could just do this, I believe, and just do a relative path. And I think that should still do what we want. But let's just verify. We can go back to Cypress and rerun our test. And we should hopefully see an image display if everything is working okay. And it's not doing what we want. So let's just go ahead and go to our network tab over here. And we want to verify that if we run this test, it should be trying to hit our random endpoint. And it doesn't seem to be hitting our random endpoint. So let's kind of go back and try to figure out what's going on. Okay, it's because I haven't actually ran this function, right? I made a function, but I didn't run it. So let's run the function. Let's go back and rerun this test, and we should see it try to hit the random endpoint, which it did. And that gives back a good.png. And then we are displaying that good PNG here directly in the browser. So that test is passing now. It's saying that, hey, we have actually displayed an image that contains the string of good.png or bad.png. So that's passing now. Now we can move on to the next part of the test is we need an upvote button and a downvote button. So let's go ahead and add those. This should be pretty simple to do. I'm going to say button of upvote, and this will just say upvote, and then I'm going to copy and paste that and do a downvote. So if I save this and refresh or rerun our tests, everything passes because we do have an image displayed that matches that regex. So we have an upvote button displayed, and we also have a downvote button displayed. So using TDD, we were able to implement our front-end functionality. Everything seems like it's good. So we can move on to the next part of this test. All right, so this one is a user can upvote on the thumbnail, which moves it to the good directory. So if someone clicks on upvote, we basically need to wait a little bit so that the backend can do its processing, and then we test to verify that, hey, there is a file in the good directory now, and that same file that was in the backlog has been deleted. Okay, so these are just lower level operating system commands we're running to verify that the file system reflects what the system should be doing. Now keep in mind that if you have user-facing functionality that we can verify that these files have been moved around, like let's say we have a new UI that displays all the good thumbnails, or a new UI that shows all the backlog thumbnails, or all the bad thumbnails, you don't need to do this lower level like operating system stuff. You should probably be hitting those public-facing endpoints or hitting those user interfaces to verify that things have been changing. But since we are not implementing those right now, we're just going to check the operating system. This might be a little dirty, but it works. And a little recap, remember we're accessing first thumbnail ID because we are caching that thumbnail ID that comes back from the backend inside a variable here, which you can access if you have a function keyword. You can just access it like this. So that's how we're doing that. And we also have a helper function that basically gets the last part of a URL because that is basically what source is going to look like. But anyway, okay, so let's try to run this test and see what happens. It'll probably fail because we haven't implemented anything. All right, so this one is failing. User can upvote on the thumbnail. So right now it's because we don't have any functionality on the upvote button. So let's go back to our UI and we're going to say document.getElement by ID. We're going to say upvote. We can add an event listener. So when someone clicks it, we can basically just do something. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to fetch, or we want to do that post request to tell the backend that, hey, the user voted this thumbnail as good. All right, so let's just go ahead and do another Axios request. I'm going to say fetch. I'm going to do that endpoint. I'm going to say, oops, thumbnails. I need to get the thumbnail ID kind of put in here. And I'm going to say, let's see, thumbnail ID. And I need to change these to backticks so that we can interpolate that. So the first thing you'll notice is that we haven't cached the thumbnail ID. So let's just go ahead and pull this out here, and we're going to remove that from const, and we're going to access that thumbnail ID right here. So that'll allow us to actually upvote on that thumbnail ID. Now remember, this endpoint is a post request, so I'm going to say method is post, and then headers, we have to say application of JSON for the content type. So I'm going to say content type is application/JSON, so the backend knows to process the body. And then we also need to pass that a body. If you remember, the backend is expecting some JSON, and the body needs to have an is good of true or false. All right. So let's just await on this. At this point, this should do a request to the backend, vote that thumbnail as good, and then what we want to do is just verify that that file has been moved. So let's just go ahead and rerun this and see what happens. Await is only valid on asynchronous functions, so I need to make sure that I put async here. And let's go back and verify that if we rerun our test, it should do something. Okay, that one's passing now. So it's saying that everything is working. The image has been moved or deleted from the good/bad directory. In fact, it should have probably removed those files. Why did it not remove good of bad? Okay, so I think I have some logic that I need to add to here, because the bad file could go to good, or the good file could go to bad, since this is random. So let's just go ahead and do that. Just make sure you clean up everything after the test runs. Let me run it one more time just in case. We're still passing, but I just wanted to clean up those extra files that were laying around. If you know a better way for doing this, let me know. But it works. I could probably abstract this to a helper function called like delete file, but whatever. Yeah, so let's move on to the test still, and let's make sure that we're not missing anything. So the test is passing, and the implementation is doing exactly what we want. So we can probably move on to this next test scenario that I've written. It says a user sees a thumbnail. It says user sees a new thumbnail on the screen, right? So basically, the UI needs to reload a new thumbnail, not just display the old one that we're looking at. So this is saying get the image, check the source, make sure that it has a different thumbnail ID. So check that the second thumbnail ID is not equal to the first thumbnail ID. So if I went ahead and ran this test, it's failing because it's showing the exact same thumbnail as we did when we first voted on it. So we need to go back and implement some changing logic here to basically change this image to be a brand new random thumbnail that we haven't seen before. So how do you do that? Well, we could just rerun this little function that we wrote. So I'm going to go down here and just run that. And that should hopefully fix this test. All right, so you saw that the image was one thing and then it changed. So let's just run this again. Really focus on this image here. You'll see that it changes real quick. All right, so the next thing we need to verify is the downvote button. We have another test case to verify that. So if we uncomment this one, we are basically saying user downvotes a thumbnail, which moves it to the bad directory. So it's very similar to that other test case with the upvote, but instead we're clicking on a downvote button. So let's go ahead and save this, run the test, and verify that it fails. All right, so it's failing. It's saying that, hey, it expected this good thumbnail to exist, but it didn't. So that is failing because we haven't implemented what happens when someone clicks on the downvote button. So let's just copy and paste this whole block here. And we could basically just change this to downvote. And we want to say is good as false here. And we still want to display a random image. All right, so very, very similar to this one, just, setting false instead. Let's go back and run our test and see if it all passes. All right, everything's good. The directory is now empty, or the file is now in the correct location. Now you'll notice the UI is actually displaying an undefined image here because there's no more items in the backlog. So there's a final test that I wrote to verify that the user should no longer see any thumbnails because the backlog is empty. So I could have maybe just checked using like a sci-exec command to verify that the backlog is empty. But I figured this is good enough. Just get the image, check the source, and make sure that it is equal to an empty string. So there is no thumbnail ID because the backend can't find any more images. Let's save this one and go ahead and rerun our test. And now everything's passing. So we have successfully wrote a Cypress test using test-driven development. I didn't really write this live because, as you can tell, it's a little bit complicated and it took me a long time to kind of refresh my memory on all these commands. So I apologize for that, but they're here if you want to reference them and kind of learn about how to do some of this stuff. But now at this point, we have an actual working integration test or end-to-end test that we can start refactoring our code if we wanted to. So all of this code is kind of duplicated. We could drive this up. So I'm going to make another function here called like vote on thumbnail. And that's going to be a function that says like is good. And really what we could do is just call these two methods and abstract away the is good argument. Okay, so we could just say vote on thumbnail here, await on it, and this is going to be true. And now this one, when you click on the downvote button, you're just going to pass false. So let's double check that this is actually working. If we go back to our tests, we can rerun them. And they are failing. Await is only valid. I think I need to add an async somewhere. I probably need to add it here. All right, so display random thumbnail. We should probably await on this as well. Anyway, so yeah, let's try rerunning the tests. Everything works. Refactor that a little bit. That looks a lot cleaner. Could this be refactored at all? Probably could. I don't think we technically need to put the, since we're using the same URL, we don't need to put that like localhost stuff. So I'm just going to try to rerun this and see if it still passes. All right, so without actually touching Chrome, the only time I touched Chrome was to make sure this Hello World page loaded, but without touching Chrome, we were able to implement a real functionality for this application all the way through, basically, to verify that we have an app that works, that the user can actually use. And on top of that, we have a ton of tests that verify that this application does what it needs to do, so that if I come back later and refactor or change anything, I'll know what I broke. So just to show you, I can go and grab those images, which are in the fixtures folder. I'm going to paste them in our backlog. And now going into Chrome, instead of going into Cypress, I can upvote these or downvote these if I want to. I'm going to say downvote, and I'm going to say downvote. The app works exactly like we saw with the Cypress runner. We have 2 files inside this bad directory now, and everything is working as we wanted it to. All right, so I hope you enjoyed watching this. This is going to wrap up this tutorial series. I showed you how to do TDD to write unit tests. I showed you how to use TDD to write integration tests. And then I showed you how you can use TDD to write out Cypress tests to implement an actual user interface that interacts with our backend. Again, sorry that I kind of just gave you a bunch of code and uncommented it, but this stuff was crazy. So if you enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up. Also, be sure to leave a comment below if you have a different approach you like to use TDD for. And like always, if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe, because I'm going to have other videos like this that should hopefully help you become a better web developer in the future.